Welcome to the Five Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and coming up on this episode, I'm joined by my old friend, Keith Fraase, the great editor, and we're discussing All That Jazz and Bob Fosse. All That Jazz being voted by the ACE, by fellow editors, as one of the 5 best edited films of all time. But first off, what I watched this week, I think I can divide it into something interesting and the thing everyone else watched. Going with what's interesting, I heard about this Hungarian film from 2011 called Final Cut, Ladies and Gentlemen, and it's not widely available, or it's not commercially available. It's actually widely available. I watched it on Vimeo, and I believe it's also officially released to YouTube. It is from 2011, but it is like the end-all be-all of mashups. This movie is clipped together of trying to tell the same story, boy meets girl, throughout all these film clips throughout the film history, and there's like over 150 clips in it. It's directed by Georgi Palfe, and I guess what happened was he had his funding taken away from him from a state grant, but he still had a post-production grant, and he had 4 editors work for 3 years on this, and it played at Cannes. But I found it on Vimeo. It's officially released on YouTube. I want to say Bellatar is listed as one of the producers on it. It's a joy. It's an absolute joy. And I mean, to be fair, I'm an easy lay for mashup movies, and especially something that can go feature length. Like I can't think of another mashup off the top of my head besides Los Angeles Plays itself. And to be fair, I get into the habit of, like, whenever I watch mashups, it's the gamification in me, but I try to see if I can pick where the clip is from. But they pick from all over the map, from Touch of Evil to Titanic to Chaplin to all over the place. But as for what I watch that everyone else watched, Godzilla versus Kong. I didn't mention this last week, but for the TV on the radio audience, who's got 2 thumbs and got vaccinated last week or like a week and a half ago? Me, or at least I got my first dose. And so, even though I'm only halfway there, I was maybe going to start braving the movie theater again, even though in theory I've been going since last July, and tried in December, January to go consistently when the theaters were still pretty dead and empty. But now Godzilla vs. Kong had like the single best pandemic opening, I believe. And so anyone who's thinking about going back to the movie, the best piece of advice I can give you, if you're still wary of it, is to, if your theater has advanced seating, just check how crowded the theater is. And when I checked, sure enough, it was crowded. So I backed off, watched it at home, and I am of multiple minds on this movie just because, in theory, this made me miss the theatrical experience that is not available to me in Evansville, just because I wanted to see this at an Alamo Drafthouse. I wanted to see this movie with a really fun pre-screening video made by people who are Toho fans and who understood the appeal of monster versus monster movies. And I really wanted to be like eating chicken wings or chips and queso while watching this. Someone else pointed out, I read recently, the film critic, this, like, after the last year of me complaining about wanting to get back into a theater, enjoy the theatrical experience, that actually there's a weird feeling in 2020 where we didn't actually miss the theater, or I didn't miss the theatrical experience as it is now. And I know if I had gone in there, I would have gone with a terrible crowd to watch this movie. And I know that's contradictory, but just an Evansville crowd, I just wouldn't imagine would enjoy movie. And just this movie is dumb. And the thing about when you had a year of theatrical movies taken away from you, I mean, I'll rail against the gatekeepers' choices on what movies are having hundreds of millions of dollars spent on them, and I'm sure they're listening and taking notes on everything I'm saying to them. But why spend the money on this? Just why? This movie is everything, just so fucking stupid. Like the scene where Brian Tyree Henry and Millie Bobby Brown, with Brian Tyree Henry playing the know-it-all podcaster, fuck those guys, and turns to Millie Bobby Brown, and they both find lines of agreement by admitting that they don't drink tap water because there's fluoride in the tap water, and the movie treats them as the smart ones. Just what what the fuck movies are we making for people? We sit around wondering why people are so conspiracy minded, and then you make the heroes and the smart ones in the movie say shit like this. It's just didn't Doctor Strangelove like have the whole plot of the movie based on the idea that a man blows up the world because he thinks that fluoride is put into water that's poisoning him, or at least making him impotent? This movie's stupid. I mean, and I think everyone else is commenting on it. The other fascinating thing about everyone's complaints about the stupidity of the movie is the usual complaint with all the Godzilla movies that the human stories are getting in the way. I either read or saw a YouTube video a while back pointing out, they did a graph comparing the American Godzilla movies with the Toho movies, and they compared and contrasted the amount of human screen time versus monster screen time. And they found that the Gareth Edwards version actually was right in the middle of the graph. And I don't pretend to be a Toho fan, so I don't. But it seems like the human stuff is the engines for these movies, and I don't know, maybe the American just hasn't nailed it yet, or the spectacle's too good. I just wish this movie was dumb, wasn't as dumb, and I'm so sick of this junk values that studio heads are putting into these movies, and movies to come back from 2020 and to get people back into theaters. Movies need to be better. They need to justify. They need to be more intimate and spectacle. The franchises no longer have a blank check on, hopefully, on the lowest common denominator. And to get asses back into seats, studios just need to make better movies. I mean, that's the bottom line of it. So, anyway, on with the episode. So, when did you end up watching this?
Last night.
What was your first viewing of this? Or was this your first Fosse movie?
No, I had seen, the first Fosse movie I saw was Cabaret. Because I
feel like that would have been a lot of people. A lot of people would have done the thing where they go through the Academy Award winner lists or something like that.
Well, I also just am a big fan of musicals in general.
I was going to say, you got the musical theater background.
Big, bold musicals is just my cup of tea. And so Cabaret I loved. I forgot when I saw it, but it definitely must have been early on, because I for as long as I can remember, I've had like a deep-seated crush on Liza Minnelli, and I think it was only from that movie. So, but yeah, so Cabaret, and then I saw Lenny, and Lenny I saw a couple of times. I was gonna try to find this. Before we talked, but I don't know if I told you this. There was like a scholarship or something I applied for in college, or maybe it was even after college. I was like thinking about going to grad school. I can't remember what. And one of the things, it was in film. It was for an editing scholarship. And one of the things I had to do was write a paper on a film that I thought was like had truly inspired editing. And I like, didn't want to choose like the standard stuff, or write about, everyone's going to write about Lawrence of Arabia and the cut from the match to the sun and stuff like that. So I was like, I wanted to find something that people probably wouldn't be talking about. So I chose Lenny. So I wrote a whole paper on Lenny. And I couldn't find it again. I don't know. I'm sure it must have been lost to somewhere in my hard drive. But I remember loving that movie so much, and the editing of it. And I've actually, when I taught classes in editing since then, I've shown scenes from Lenny and tried talking about it.
What's funny is, as I've gotten more into the research, rereading a little of Sam Wasson's book, and just hearing Alan Heim, the editor of both Lenny and All That Jazz talk, like, deceptively, it sounds like Lenny is the more, because a lot of what's impressively edited in All That Jazz was written in. And they talked about how it was staged that way and ended up being more restrictive just because they would shot, I assume, not in a nonlinear fashion where they knew what was cutting to what. And whereas, as a process we've discovered in the past, a lot of times it's more interesting, and sometimes, if you get it right, organic, to discover this than to have it like conceptualized that way. And you gives you more freedom to actually make it work once you're in the editorial room. And Lenny was that way. They discovered more.
Mm. That's so interesting. Well, I actually am fascinated to hear that any of what was done in All That Jazz was actually written to the script, because it feels like it was all found. Like so much of it seems like it was found and discovered and had to be experimented with. I don't know how a person could possibly have written that into the script.
Well, you get to that last half hour. That last half hour where there's two Bob Fosses. One's in a hospital bed. One's directing himself. Right. So you have to figure that out. But I mean, so my I don't really have auspicious like memory of. I did watch Bob Fosse a bit in high school before going into college, but he wasn't one of those early people. But I really thought that he only did 3 movies. I thought he did Cabaret, Lenny, All That Jazz. I saw Star 80 a few years later I've mentioned it a few times on this show. Richard Linklater used to have a series that he would show 35 millimeter prints at the Marquesa in Austin for this series he called Jewels in the Wasteland, about movies from the 80s that were ignored. And so I saw that for the first time on a print that he presented. And then I just saw Sweet Charity, Fosse's very first movie, just a few weeks ago. And we'll get into Sweet Charity later. I probably should kind of glaze over it just because there's not much to say about it except a historical antecedent. But the thing about Cabaret, when I first saw it, I didn't really think of it as a musical. And reading more about it, this editorial idea he had where the musical sequences were separated from basically non-musical dramatic scenes played out around it, and then when they got to editorial, they found that they started intercutting the actual dramatic stuff with the musical sequences. It still gave you the musical feeling of characters expressing something or something being expressed more. But because like Fosse described Cabaret as the first adult musical, or at least the first adult American musical. And then you go into Lenny, which besides a few strip dance numbers, doesn't really have much music and has very, very few dance into it. And then you do the intercutting there too, where it's based on a play where there would be Lenny Bruce stand-up stuff, and then it would be intercut with a scene that's supposed to juxtapose that. And then they decided to cut it together. And he found that as he embraced editorial more, he wrote it into All That Jazz, apparently.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, the thing that I always... So it's been years since I've seen Cabaret. Lenny, I've seen more recently, and obviously All That Jazz I just recently watched. But the progression of, and I've never seen the other films, Sweet Charity or Star 80.
You'd be good to watch Star 80. Let's just say that.
Okay.
With an omission there, you're good to watch Star 80. Silence.
Well, because I love the progression. The progression from Cabaret to Lenny to All That Jazz is so fascinating because, if memory serves, Cabaret is brilliantly done, but it is in a sense more conventionally done than Lenny or All That Jazz.
Oh yeah,
and that it feels like a musical or at least like you say, an adult musical. But I remember why I always talk about Lenny is that I feel like what a leap artistically that must have been for someone who is like, you can feel Fosse, someone who's known as being a choreographer, like that is his famous, that is what everyone knows him for. And like he's trying to break out of that mold, and so he's going to make a movie that I remember. If I actually remember correctly, Lenny has very little non-diegetic music in it. Like it's mostly
I think so. Yeah, there's some overlapping dialogue, but not. I don't think they do anything much musically with it.
Right, but the editing of it is so musical. It actually has like a jazz kind of feel to it. It's almost like they use Dustin Hoffman's speeches as like a percussive nature to edit against that in some ways.
So you're getting to a point that I found in I tried to read as much of the Sam Wasson book as I could, but my eyes were bigger than my stomach on that. But one of the things I found, not in that book, but in a completely different documentary, Glenn Verdon, Fosse's ex-wife, who was the half of the recent FX miniseries Fosse-Verdon, pointed out, this is a pet theory of mine, Bob Fosse was a drummer. And I have a pet theory that there's a lot of great directors who have been drummers. Stanley Kubrick was a drummer. Damien Chazelle was a drummer, obviously, with Whiplash. But
Yeah.
then I've heard in the past, I feel like Richard Linklater was a drummer. But then you also have people like Peyton Reed, who directed um, the Ant-Man movies, and he's directed some Get Over It, or not Get Over It, but he's a drummer. There's something with the rhythm of an editorial style. And one of the things they found when Fosse got into the editing room was for a guy that works so in three-dimensional space and live action stage numbers, he still had such a sense of rhythm just because of all he was doing with dance, and that he just took to editorial so strongly. And it also goes to this. The other reason I want to talk to you, an editor, about Bob Fosse is Bob Fosse is one of two main directors coming out of this time who embrace editorial, especially non-linear editorial, in a way it's shocking. Him and Nicholas Roeg, and both of them come from not editorial backgrounds. Fosse's obviously a choreographer, stage director, and Nicholas Roeg was a cinematographer. He was the cinematographer most notably on, where everyone kind of attributes his nonlinear stuff from Richard Lester's Petulia, but he was also like the second unit photographer on Lawrence of Arabia. And like these people were just like jumped into an editorial room and saw how they could play with time in fun ways.
Right. So fascinating. I was thinking about this before, leading up to this earlier this week. So another film that I watched recently, which I've been excited to talk to you about, is Reds. I'd never seen Reds before.
You watch Reds?
Yeah, and so the reason why I watch Reds, I can't get into this too much, but I'm working on a project right now that is using Reds as a little bit of a stylistic.
Yeah, okay, you have told me a little bit about this, which is also fascinating. If you go back to Lenny, I was surprised at how much of the the honey stuff, or like the interview stuff there, like
right, exactly,
is an antecedent to that.
Yeah, and I'm not bringing this up necessarily to talk about the interview stuff, although all that stuff is brilliant in Reds. But there is a quality of editing that I saw in Reds that's also very similar in all that jazz, and also in Lenny, in that there's a here's actually how I'm going to describe it. I was at a test screening for a film that I was working on. I won't say which film, but I was at a test screening, and someone who was in the test screening was a film critic, and they came up to me and talked to me afterwards. And I mean, they were okay with how the whole film played out, but mainly there was something that we had done in the very beginning of the film that was a little bit more fast-paced. And what he said was, I'll never forget, he described it this way. He said, the beginning of the film was very crunchy. You have a lot of crunchy editing in there.
Crunchy.
And I'm like, I have no idea what that means. But what I took it to realize...
But you do know what that means, though. That's an evocative term.
It's a very evocative, and I feel like that's the kind of editing style of something like Reds and something like All That Jazz, where the editing is very... it's very staccato, if you want to use a musical term, but it's like it's freewheeling, it's messy. Scenes are cut off in the middle of sentences, and it's funny because they actually, I had not remembered this about All That Jazz, but at one point in time, when they're showing the I don't know how much we have to explain about All That Jazz and the plot of it, but
we're good not to. We're good.
Yeah, okay.
I don't care.
If
you're listening to this point, you have to have seen this movie by now. It's
right.
So,
yeah. Early, basically when the movie that they're making in the film, the stand-up, comes out, and they're all gathered around in the hospital bed watching the television critic rip it apart. She's talking about the frantic editing, where scenes are cut off before the dramatic action resolves itself.
Yeah, I remember that phrase particularly. I thought that was a good thing.
Yeah, and exactly. I was like, no, that's what makes it so brilliant, is that the scenes are that type of editing style where scenes don't settle and where you jump out at the climax is so invigorating to me. I could watch a million hours of a film that if it just kept... you don't always want to do that, but it makes I realize that when I'm editing a film and I'm not at my most inspired, and I let the scene settle, the film gets into a certain rhythm or pace that becomes lugubrious,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
at
yeah.
least if nothing else, predictable.
Yeah.
And if no one can say that all that jazz is predictable in any way, shape, or form in terms of how it's edited.
I rewatched All That Jazz a few weeks ago, but just a few minutes before we got to this, I saw for the first time I watched it with the Alan Heim, the editor's commentary, and he said he hadn't seen it in years. He saw it in an Academy screening a while back, but this is the first time he'd seen it in a while, and so he was going to go through this rediscovery emotional journey of like seeing this again for the first time in a few years, and he just kept saying over and over, he's like, wow, this flows really well, and that's something editorially you go for, just because you like William Goldman famously described, you want to get into a scene as late as possible and out as early as possible. And from a writing standpoint, I get that, but I have always found it to be more, you don't want the audience to feel that they understand the rhythm of a scene so that they know where it's going and they can predict where it's going. So if they understand the rhythm of a scene when the scene's only like halfway through, they kind of know where it's going and they're bored already. So that's why you want to cut off the beginning and cut off the end, just because it also just connects the previous scene to the next scene, and it just keeps the movie flowing better.
Yeah, this movie tumbles along like, I mean, it tumbles along like a drum solo. Like you're just constantly with
Like
the
a drum
rhythms
solo.
changing and moving, and it's absolutely fascinating to watch from a craft point of view. And also just in terms of how much I saw so many things in this film that I clearly influenced later films. That I don't know. I mean, you know, films evolve over time, and this film probably influenced another film that influenced the film that I'm actually thinking of. But I so first off, I want to point out the strange difficulty that Shane, both you and I had in tracking down this movie, and how I sat down to watch this film a couple of nights ago, and I was like, okay, let me see where it's streaming. Okay, well, it's not streaming anywhere for free. That makes sense, but I couldn't find it on the Criterion channel. I couldn't rent it on Amazon.
That is very. We can go into a little later. I don't know if there were some rights issues because Fosse was near finished filming, and it was I want to say an Orion movie, or it was either Columbia or an Orion movie, and they needed extra money, and Fosse had a way of using his theatrical production style to film, so where sometimes he would shut down production to like do a number. They got stuck on the last number, I believe it was, and when they started balking at money, they went ahead. Heim had to put together a show reel over the weekend, and they sold it to Fox to get another half of the budget into it, and then Fox ended up winning domestic for it. And so I don't know if that screwed up the rights. I watched. I don't know how many years it is, but I happen to have the glorious Criterion Blu-ray of it. Although when I last watched it, for some stupid reason, I watched the fucking DVD, and on this commentary I watched the Blu-ray because I didn't know I was a Blu-ray, but.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely order it. I'm just always so shocked. You know, we're of a generation that like it's almost offensive when we can't find something that's online. You know, our entire like childhoods have been digitized on and are available somewhere on YouTube. The most obscure commercial that we saw in the '90s is available somewhere. So the fact that an Oscar nominee and a Palme d'Or winner.
ACE voted this the 4th best edited movie of all time. A current recurring theme, which I think is a losing battle on this podcast, is the physical media and buying stuff. So, yeah, no, I get it. I mean,
no, I appreciate the physical media. I would love to own the DVD, but
it's also physical media, and you got to store it somewhere, and you live in New York, so
yeah, that's right. I've already maxed out my DVD capacity in my closet. But I was going to say that in terms of like the films that this clearly inspired. I mean, I don't know if this is where he got it from, but the It's Showtime Folks montage with the Dexedrine popping of the pills.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that where Aronofsky got his like hip hop montage inspiration from for Requiem for a Dream?
It almost, I mean, it has to be almost. Wow.
I mean that must. I mean, because like I didn't realize how closely those are, how similar they are. I mean, you even got the
A reoccurring motif image that starts with the bottle popping.
yeah, we even got like the dilation of the eyes. I mean, he's putting like drops in his eyes and stuff like
Right.
that. He's not shooting up heroin, but it's I just thought that the rhythms of it were so similar to that of the the hip hop montage, which I've studied deeply in film school. So
I was surprised. There was a few antecedents that and there was bizarre ones. Like on the commentary, Heim pointed out, hopefully the subject of another episode we're planning on doing in the future. He said one sequence referenced the singing detective, which I didn't see, but that's kind of surprising. Jessica Lange as Death kind of reminds me of the Neil Gaiman series Sandman and their interpretation of death.
oh, interesting.
Yeah, like there's a lot of like
Well, some of those aspects you can clearly see the. I mean, I had forgotten how similar it was to Eight and a Half. I mean, there's the obvious ideas, but there are so many more, similarities in that.
this gets okay. This is the point I wanted to bring up. Did you read this recent essay Scorsese published about Fellini? The internet kind of let it spread because he defined what he thought of content was what they got from it, which is only in like the first 3 paragraphs. But the whole essay is about Fellini. It's a good essay too. Did you see that?
I didn't read it. No.
Well, he dictates that he mentions all that jazz in the essay, but he talks about the series of films that came from Eight and a Half. That, for starters, we're going to have to go into Fosse's influence from Fellini. This movie's shot by Giuseppino Rotuno, who is Fellini's cinematographer. But Sweet Charity is based off Nights of Cabiria, which stars Juliet Massino, which is one of your go-tos.
Oh yeah.
But Scorsese in the essay points out 3 films that come from Eight and a Half. Only or 2 which I knew. This one, Stardust Memories from Woody Allen, and the first one, which I've never seen, is Paul Mazursky's Alice in Wonderland. But this gets to one of the weird tonal, maybe philosophical oddities I find about this movie, that once you watch it, it's a director making an autobiographical movie about him apologizing to all the people in his life while being very straightforward and honest about all the things going through his life, but he's still in a position of power. And he's still like, you get the sense that he's sorry for all the stuff he's doing, but he's not willing to change anything in his life to make anything better for the people around him.
Yeah, it's fascinating watching this movie now in today's age, because I've as I was watching it, I was just thinking about like, hey, this is kind of a movie. Like you can't, you can't make a movie like this. I mean, what's so interesting about it? How do I put this? It's a weird movie wherein that's deeply misogynistic, but it's also.
I'm glad you said it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's deeply misogynistic. It's also egotistical. In that, I mean, it's just egotistical from the standpoint of like, I mean, Eight and a Half is the same way. In that, like, how do you're like, I'm going to make a movie about myself, and
when you make a movie that big, I mean, a production inherently involves so many resources and so many people. So you're involving all this money and value to go into someone getting out your inner soul, but also you get so navel-gazing to describe like the process of making a movie. Like one of the things that was in the Sam Wasson book they described was the reaction to the cast and crew screen, which I found fascinating because, Fosse's detailing all these people in his life who are then turning around. Some of these people are playing themselves. Alan Heim plays himself. I want to say there's like 3 or 4 other people involved in life who play themselves. And when they read the script, you know this experience. When you read the script, you kind of get an idea of what the vibes, the intentions of the movie are, but you don't really get it until you see the full scene on screen. And when the cast and crew, one of the quotes they had was, or the quote from the book he said was, "He/it was an egomaniacal, narcissistic, an old favorite, courageous, immature, brilliant, fake Fellini, 4 1/4. He was announcing suicide, crying out for attention, apologizing, pleading to be understood, asking to be crowned a genius." And then like one person who watched the screening said apparently it was just a poll over the cast and crew screening. One said it's like, I've been working for a madman, but at least I finally understand his moody moments.
That's so fascinating. Well, that's what makes the movie so interesting is that like it is like I said, like the character is both shown the character of Joe Gideon is both shown to be somebody who's despicable and not to be given much sympathy, but it's also to be heralded as a genius, to be heralded for his work, to be shown as actually a misunderstood genius. So it's this weird film of like you can tell it's a confessional.
It's a confession.
And,
yeah, totally.
And that's admirable, but it's not just a confessional. It is also like he's also blowing smoke up his own ass a bit, and I mean it's hard to say because Fosse is a genius or was a genius. And but it's just these weird kind of I mean this is the kind of strange narcissistic endeavor to make a film about yourself, so deeply about yourself and so clearly about yourself. And it's interesting to, as an artist, I'm sure, to like explore your own darkness, I think is very, very admirable as an artistic achievement. But there's also so many problematic aspects of the film because while exploring the darkness, there's also plenty of other avenues that he shows. It's almost like it's I don't even know how to put it. It's almost like he's looking back into his past and trying to apologize for certain things that he's still in the process of doing.
Oh, totally.
While he's making this movie.
Well, so one of the fascinating things was rewatching this. I think this is now my third viewing. I feel like reading the Sam Wasson book as much as I got into it. He nailed a lot of what his problems were, and he nailed a lot of what the people in his life thought his problems were. But the other big reason I wanted to do this, and the reason Fosse's been on my mind, was you didn't by chance see any from a few years ago, the Fosse-Verdon miniseries?
No, I didn't.
The Fosse-Verdon miniseries is based on the Sam Wasson book, but what I had heard from a friend was that their daughter wanted Gwen Verdon to be involved, be a bigger part of the thing, just to point out how much she was in part of the process. And you resaw a lot of the stuff he was talking about in all that jazz from the point of view of a person who was just not just like this side character that doesn't pass the Bechdel test of being like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, or what's the quote at the end? At least I won't have to lie to you anymore. Like, right. Not that person who's like, oh, I'm a fully actualized person because you told me you don't have to lie to me anymore. This actually like dramatized the real thing. The 8th episode is the one I wanted to talk about because the way the series goes is it covers all of his movies. It doesn't go to Star 80, but it starts out with Sweet Charity. And the final episode, Bob Fosse was best friends with, amongst other playwrights, Paddy Chayefsky. Paddy Chayefsky is a major character in the series. Mm-hmm. And the 8th episode owns with this monologue this dialogue between them in Central Park, where Fosse's about a month away from shooting, and he's complaining about the script. And earlier episodes, Fosse has been pushing himself, and he's had his heart attack in '74 or whenever it was. And ended up, Paddy Chayefsky had another heart attack, and he's closer to death right now too. So they're commiserating as two friends who've had heart attacks. And Fosse complains about what he's doing. He's like, I'm a month out. I need to change writers. The script's not working. And Paddy Chayefsky's like, the problem's always the same with all your movies. Your ending is shit because your characters don't change. And he says, and then Fosse tries to, as Sam Rockwell's playing Fosse, and Norbert Leo Butz is playing Chayefsky. Sam Rockwell tries to defend and says, well, Lenny doesn't change, Charity doesn't change, and Chayefsky complains like, yeah, it's the problem with all your movies. Your endings suck because your characters don't change. And then he dictates a better way of how this movie could have played out. And he gives a 3-act structure where Act 1 is where Joe Gideon is named from a Chayefsky play. That's where the name came from. Act 1, Joe meets a beautiful girl, falls in love, and Act 2, he realizes he's selfish, and he keeps screwing around and can't stop himself. He ends up in the hospital. And then Act 3 is when he realizes that Gwen Verdon was the woman he wanted to be with all along. Now, granted, the series is about him and Gwen Verdon's relationship, but also Anne Marie King is the girlfriend from the first act in this scenario. Anne Marie King plays herself pretty much in all that jazz. And I think in this 8th episode, they actually dramatize her having to audition to play herself too.
That's crazy. Yeah, I'd read that she had that she had to audition for the part, and how that it was humiliating for her. But I mean, she does a beautiful job in the movie.
But this also goes to the weird thing of all that jazz is about an autobiography where Fosse went down to such details as the Dexedrine bottle, the address on the Dexedrine bottle is 3 streets off from his real address.
Wow.
But at the same time, he still pretended it's not him. Alan Heim in the editing room kept talking about the character and referencing him as Bob, and Fosse would get pissed off at that. And then in the commentary, I shit you not, he's like, he was telling that, like, oh yeah, Bob will get mad at when I do that. And then when he starts referring to the character, occasionally he slips and calls the character Bob. In the commentary, like, I don't know, 30 years later?
Why do you think that is? Why is it that someone who's making, I mean, someone who's making something that's clearly autobiographical, to not embrace the aspect of it, to not say, because I actually feel like, you know what, I'm going to say this, I think that there's a problem with that remove that you that if you are thinking of it as a character, you give more license, you can give more, because, you know, I was trying to something that I actually do admire a little bit more in 8.5 that I think is handled better than in something like All That Jazz is in 8.5, the man is not only it's been several years since I've seen 8.5, so bear with me.
Same here. I was going to say, I don't think 8.5 tries to hide it.
Well, 8.5, yeah, I feel like Fellini embraced the fact, but the director, Marcello Mastroianni, he's also in a creative slump. He's someone who's had past success, but he's someone who is both emotionally and creatively, impotent at the time. You know, he's not really sure, and I think there's something about that feels very honest, and not you never feel that the movie exists to inflate someone's ego or to stroke someone's ego, rather.
8.5 is famously named because it's Fellini's 8.5 movie because he counts a short. But as you mentioned, Joe Gideon is at the top of the world whenever he's doing this. Like, I mean, in real life, Bob Fosse, I mean, he's 7 years removed from having the first ever EGOT in 1 year.
Right. Yeah, and also, I mean, he's in the middle of working on. I mean, I guess he accepts that Lenny is a failure.
Although it wasn't. I think it did well financially, and it got a bunch of. Fairly, I think everything except Cabaret got bad reviews, but like most of his movies got Oscar nominations until Star 80.
Right. And I think that, and also, I mean, he like you said, he's at the top of his game, because I mean the play that he's the play that he's working on in the movie is going to be Chicago, which is going to be a massive artistic and commercial success.
See, I don't know if that's true. After watching Fosse-Verdon and reading a little bit of the book, there's a musical he did called Dancing. I want to say it was before this time, where it was something that he just came up on the spot, and it involves like this vague orgy on an airplane. And this last viewing, the big sex sequence, the big sex dance sequence where, I guess Sinatra's not going to sing this song.
Right.
I guess that indicated this is really that's not Chicago, but also I kind of came to that conclusion after watching Fosse-Verdon, because Chicago is a huge linchpin, just because Verdon wants to take much more credit for Chicago than she's gotten in history too.
Oh, interesting. Um, anyway, I just feel like,
Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, no, but still, like, the problem is that, like, this film is a mixture of both confronting and addressing the wrongs that you know, the main character has committed to these women throughout his life. But also, it is still a film that shows him as someone who is desirable, who has slept with all these different women, who is a misunderstood genius. Because even when Lenny, or the stand up in the movie, when it's torn apart by that critic, he's portrayed as a misunderstood genius. And I'm saying this as someone who loves Lenny, who thinks Lenny is brilliant, who thinks all the jazz is brilliant.
I rewatched Lenny today, and I hadn't seen Lenny since high school. I forgot how fucking good it is.
Yeah, it's great, and so it's right. And so that's the other complicated aspect of this, is that he's right. He was a misunderstood genius in his time, and or at least when it comes to these particular films. But I just think that, like, but it is hard watching it in 2021, where you're seeing a privileged, white man making a film about woe is me.
Woe is me is the phrase I was thinking a lot, and it's a powerful. There's another aspect I wanted to talk to you about with the musical. One of the musical aspects I found is that, okay, I can finally go a little into Sweet Charity. I was shocked just because when I finally watched Sweet Charity, it's a stage show him and Gwen Verdon had done together, amongst others. That was one of Verdon's big successes. She had a lot of successes, obviously, on stage. Mm-hmm. And it was a big budget. I can't remember if it was Warner's or Columbia or who did it, but it was that period in the late 60s where the studios were dying because they kept putting all this money into these big budget failures. It was like the Dr. Dolittle time, or the How the West Was Won era, or not How the West Was Won, Paint Your Wagons or stuff like that. And it's like a 2.5, maybe 2:45 movie with an intermission that just, you get through like the first half and you're just like, I don't know what I'm glad Ricardo Montalban's in the movie, but I don't know what he was doing in the movie. And it's an overlit, stiff Cabaret in many ways is a reaction to it. And if you give Fosse credit cinematically for changing the musical form, a few years ago, actually, when we first worked together, the big script I had written that I was trying to get made at the time with all people we worked with, I had written a musical. And I was fascinated by this idea of the musical going from, when I was a teenager first becoming a film snob. I don't know if you got this when you first started getting into film, but you talk to your friends or your parents and they'd be like, oh, you're into film. What genres don't you like? And you want to be like, I like every genre because there's a good version of every genre and there's a bad version of every genre. But when I was a teenager, I would answer that with musicals. I hated musicals because at the time, well, years before that, the Disney Broadway version of that was where, to me, a musical was this very facile, almost commercial selling of something, like where lyrics were just, I always got the sense that people doing song and dance were trying too fucking hard to please me, and it was exhausting to watch sometimes. And Fosse feels like, if you do the transition, but you don't count Lenny, between Sweet Charity to Cabaret to all that jazz, you see a very sophisticated transition into what a musical should be from an adult standpoint and what it can express, and how it can also just not be this like song dance please you as you go along format thing. As someone that I know was into into musicals in high school, I kind of wanted to put that to you. What's your thoughts?
Unabashedly so. I still to this day love almost all musicals. So first,
I am a massive convert on musicals, by the way, but at the time, but a lot of it is this modern, they have to be like expressing the things a character can't say in normal life,
Well, I can't remember who said this or where I heard this, but this was all, I think this kind of best adequately or best expresses why I think, like, why do musicals work? Like, why do they work at all? Like, why does it, like, why, film is all about us.
Why did they get past the suspension of disbelief?
Exactly. I was going to say that. Yeah, film is all about the suspension of disbelief, and how are we able to suspend disbelief when someone who had just been talking all of a sudden starts singing and dancing? And someone said at one point that for all of humanity, we sing when we're at our most, when our emotions are most peaked. You know, like when think about like being in church and like being in, or you know, or you're at a football game and you start singing a song, the team song or something like that, and or anything like you sing when you're so riled up and you have so much emotion and you just rah, you know, or I don't know.
Someone said this to you?
Well, no, I heard it in some interview. I can't remember who it was or what it is. It's it's one of those things that's. I'm sure I'm destroying what the actual message of it was, but it was bouncing. It's been bouncing around in my head for years. But there is this notion that whenever we want to express, can't be expressed through any sort of intelligent speech. You sing and that comes out as pure emotion. And I think for some reason that works, and that's why the songs that I've always loved the most is when a character is just at its, I love the big ballads. I love those things where someone is just like, the energy in them is vibrating so much that it's almost like the lyrics don't matter at that point. It's the high notes matter. The belting matters. And here's the thing. So, okay, my movie that is so, not only do I love, but it's actually instrumental to a lot of what I do and a lot of what I think in terms of any sort of creative aspect when it comes to filmmaking, is Jesus Christ Superstar. I have always adored Jesus Christ Superstar. I saw it for the first time when I was, I think, 16 or something like that. I saw it on stage and then I watched the movie. I actually don't love it that much as a stage musical, but the movie of it, who was it done by? Norman Jewison.
I'm sorry to say I've never seen it. It's a favorite of my dad's, who I think was trying to push it onto me in his born again Christian phase, but I don't think I've ever seen it.
Yeah, I think it was directed by Norman Jewison, the same guy who did
Fiddler on the Roof.
Fiddler on the Roof. Yeah, thank you. And it's beautifully done. But it's just something about it is.
I remember the Mr. Show parody more than anything else.
I've never seen that, but there is the vocal acrobatics that Andrew Lloyd Webber puts singers through in that is, it's a rock musical and people are hitting high notes and stuff, and it's just got so much, I don't know, it actually has swagger to it, and it's not that important me talking about this. I'm just gushing about a musical that I've always loved, but it does come down to the fact that it's like when emotions are peaked, you can't speak anymore, you have to sing. But that being said, and that's why I've always loved musicals. But I will say that what I love about All That Jazz and Lenny and Cabaret to a certain extent is the same thing, is they're actually kind of in a way anti-musicals.
Yeah, totally.
All That Jazz is an anti-musical in the same way. I kept thinking about one of my favorite Godard films is A Woman is a Woman. And
I think we've talked about this before. That, for the longest time, was the only Godard movie that I had a great time with, because I saw it at an Alamo screening where the audience fucking ate it up.
Oh, it's a blast. And the thing I remember most about it is like there's a whole opening segment that has lush, rich, traditional musical orchestration. And it's all building towards the main character, this woman, like getting on stage, and she like turns around and is about to sing her song, and the music cuts out and she starts singing a cappella. And then as soon as she stops singing, the music comes back in, and it's so, and not only is it just meta and interesting in a meta way, it's also like dramatically rich. And it's emotional in kind of a way, and she feels kind of lonely and naked and bare in a way that she wouldn't otherwise have been. And I just realized that, that's the whole like subverting of expectations that All That Jazz does, and to a certain extent. I will actually say, the thing is that the musical numbers of All That Jazz are actually my least favorite parts of the movie.
This last viewing, I'll be, not to contradict you, but I was really taken with them just because I've watched the three big Fosse movies within a day and a half, but like especially the ones in the last half hour, like
See, okay, I have to jump in there for just a second because this is the one. Okay, well,
okay.
first off, I want to contradict what I just said. I will say the best scene in the movie, in my mind, is when I can't remember her name, Anne Rinking,
Yeah.
when her and the daughter do their little dance
Yeah,
for him.
that's a cute scene.
Like the one moment of joy in his life. Beautiful, beautiful scene. So I was wondering when we were going to talk about this, but I'll just jump right in. I love all that jazz. The last 10 minutes are terrible. I've always hated
You hate the last 10 minutes. Okay. Well, Alan Heim pointed out he thought that it wasn't until the end of the movie. There was it was the sequence where like after the first heart attack where Gideon kind of roams around the hospital. He was
I
just
love
like,
that.
see,
To me, that's
I thought that stuff was like, what are we doing? And Heim was like, I think this was a little long. But then he got to the bye bye life sequence at the end, and he's like, yeah, this was long. We've had fights over this. I want to short it.
well, that's the thing. It's like once you get into that Everly Brothers song, and first off, it loses all subtlety. It actually goes into camp in a way that I don't think Fosse. This is a weird thing to say, but Fosse does, like you would think Fosse would do camp really well, but I don't think it. First off, I don't think it works because I don't know what they were doing having Rory Scheider sing. He should not have opened his mouth and sung in any sort of way.
And I noticed Heim was also pointing out that he wasn't keeping rhythm, and he had to cut around rhythmically dancing because we also haven't gotten to the whole fact that Richard Dreyfuss was originally supposed to play this role.
I didn't know that at all. Richard Dreyfuss?
We'll go into this in a second. I didn't want to derail your thought. We'll go into this in a second. But but the whole thing, Fosse said he'd have to cut around whoever he cast as a dancer.
You know, it's funny because actually, I feel like there's a couple moments where the dancing actually I do buy. I buy that Rory Scheider did
I bought the dancing the whole time. I don't know if this is just a lack of sophistication on me. I'm pretty sure it is.
But him singing "Bye Bye Life," "Bye Bye Your," like here's the thing. I had totally forgotten that Ben Vereen was in this movie, and I adore Ben Vereen. I will watch 1,000 hours of Ben Vereen just sitting
Ben
down.
Vereen's also a Fosse standby too. He's a big part of Sweet Charity, I believe. Yeah.
Well, one of the first you want to talk about my love of musical theater. One of the first memories I have of musical theater is watching an old Sesame Street segment where Ben Vereen sings "Mr. Cellophane," and I have never forgotten that. And that's so I have a deep love for Ben Vereen because of that moment. So anyway, I'm totally happy that Ben Vereen's there. Don't know what he's doing there, but he shows up at the end there, and I think the musical choice of "Bye Bye Love," it goes on forever. It becomes like this weird campy stage show. The only thing that works about it for me is the quick cut to the zipping of the bag is effective.
Yeah, I think that was going to be my argument. The quick cut is like a very effective cut. I almost feel like the whole sequence is worth it for that. But
that's basically it. I just think it's unsubtle and it's just the tone of the whole movie changes. And I also think, just to talk about the quick cut thing for a second, he does a similar thing with Lenny. If I remember correctly, the Lenny is kind of, it's not a musical segment, but the end of Lenny, I remember, is like a build-up montage that quickly all of a sudden arrives at him. You see that famous image of Lenny Bruce's like bathroom or whatever it is.
That's the final image of the movie. Today I was kind of really paying attention to it because I remember it as similar, and it didn't play out that way. What it is the mother, Lenny's mother drives away with his daughter and makes a complaint about him losing weight. And then you very clearly are introduced to the information. He's dead. He died. And the cops are coming in, but people are walking around the body. And then the last sequence of the movie is like them talking about what happened with his death. There's implication that he killed himself because he didn't have money for the trial or going to prison. And then that image, they zoom out on that image, is the final image of the movie.
I see. Okay. I must have been misremembering it. But anyway, yeah, so the last little bit of, I don't know, there's something, because like I do love, actually, so again, Joe Gideon wandering around the hospital, People are trying to find him. He has that kind of nice moment with the janitor.
That is a great moment. Yeah, that is a good moment.
Yeah, where they're like singing the songs and they're singing the
Teach
old
it to me
vaudeville
again.
songs. Yeah, like that. I think is actually all lovely and beautiful. It really is just like all of a sudden like this weird stage show that just I feel like. Oh, and again the the stuff where it's featuring his like the director stuff of him in the bed I think is all great. The stuff featuring his ex-wife and his girlfriend and his daughter is beautiful and actually moving. It really is just like the final, unfortunately, sorry Ben Vereen, it's like your final number. Maybe it's also because I have my own connotations with Bye Bye Love. I feel like it's too famous of a song.
That's fair. I think that's totally fair. I think what you're pointing out is where the woe is me comes out more than anything else.
Right. Well, yeah, that's that final line. At least you won't have to, what does he say? I won't have to hurt you anymore or anything like that.
There's a few things I want to point out about this. There's a ton of things I want to point out about this sequence. One of the craziest things I learned in the commentary, Alan Heim got halfway through cutting the sequence and got a phone call that his mother had died and then didn't work on the sequence for a long time. And then it was rough finishing the sequence after that.
Wow.
Yeah. He was very, like I mentioned earlier, he was very observant of Roy Schneider's rhythms because he thought he was off as a dancer, which also makes me realize how amazing and invisible he was good about making sure all the other dancers were on rhythm, even though they're probably well trained, just because that was very likely a very big Fosse thing he was pushing.
I think the thing that actually, as I think about it, that sold me so much on Scheider's dancing, that scene, it's like the first scene when you really get introduced to his daughter, where he's like going through different poses with her, is lovely. Having a
I think just a few scenes later is the one where he has he's doing the choreography, he has the dancer on his back, and he's just like moving slowly in rhythm with everybody else, with the dancer just like lifting her off the ground with their shoulders kind of entwined with each other.
Yeah, there's a certain confidence that he brings to it that I think that does sell it. But man, I just want to linger for a second because I do think that that's a beautiful. The stuff with the daughter is lovely and I think escapes all the issues that I've been talking about with the misogyny and stuff like that. You can see a father who very clearly loves his daughter, but it's very. But again, from Fosse's perspective, acknowledging where he's failed as a parent.
I think the relationship with his daughter is the thing that comes across most in the movie. It was a bigger deal in the Sam Wasson book, and obviously she was a major producer on the Fosse-Verdon miniseries. So like they talk, a big subplot on the show is about like throughout the years while he was drinking and pill popping, and the rest of the family was drinking a little, she would sneak in stuff here and there. And she had to deal with addiction later in life, but she's been sober for apparently a long time too. So,
yeah, it's I mean, I know nothing about their relationship outside of the film. I can only speak really to what was shown in the film and what the character was. But I just think there's something so tender and loving about that scene where like they're going through the motions, because like you can tell like that's where having a daughter myself, not quite that age, but my daughter's 5, and I like being able to share your there's something about communicating through your passions that really showcases, or there's a connection there that's it's even hard to talk about, so and you can see that in this scene, like, they're both like, to see that his daughter is engaged in dance in a way that is very meaningful to him, and like the way that they communicate the best is by like, okay, you do this, put your legs around me, and I'm going to do this, and it's so tender and loving, but he's also at the same time, this is his passion in his job, and he's also like he's also choreographing at something at the moment, so he's like
his
focused
calling
on
in
else.
Life,
so he's like both focused on her but not focused on her, and I don't know, I really thought that was such a lovely scene. And again, because I have a daughter, maybe it's me just like the scenes with the daughter, I just like immediately latch onto. But I just wanted to like mention that scene and then the scene with the where she dances with the girlfriend. I think is just so they're the few moments of grace in the movie.
I I
So
I I I think they're clearly the parts where the autobiographical uh aspects kind of seem pure. And when he's apologized, because all the books about Fosse, the miniseries in the book really makes a point that like Fosse just really wanted to fuck anything that came across his path, and like he was constantly cheating on whoever he was with, and they try to give this like Rosebudian big deal about him losing his virginity as a vaudeville dancer to some strippers when he was a kid, and both.
mhm.
I mean, all that jazz has a sequence with it where he, or it, I guess he messed himself, but like it kind of looks like he peed his pants, but he messed himself in all the jazz. But in Fosse-Verdon, they're much clearer on the actual seduction there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they, but it still seems like I don't know. It seems like a cop out if you're stuck to fidelity, but all of us are stuck to fidelity, so it still seems like a cop out. I don't know. Like, well, okay. Speaking of cop outs and odd things of like the self-destructive nature, there's two things I want to talk about. The two of the last three episodes, 2 episodes back, we talked about Southland Tales and Richard Kelly, and I was fascinated by this idea that a lot of what people glommed onto, in not just like something like Donnie Darko, but also there's more emerging aspects in Southland Tales, and in this are the aspects of suicidal ideation. The fact that like you know the reason I never knew about Star 80 was because I thought this was Bob Fosse's last film, because I thought he made this film knowing he was going to die.
Oh,
And
interesting.
this movie like is so about death, and the the Wasson book's all about death. I don't know, it's not so much in Fosse-Verdon, but like there's a quote from Ring King says where this is not a man who does not want to die, but he did want to flirt with death. And then he cast Jessica Lange in, who was at the time, I don't know what role she did in between this and King Kong, but like King Kong wasn't well received and she was known as this model actress. This is like 3 years before she got her first Oscar nomination. Everyone knew she was a amazing actress.
Mhm.
You get this beautiful actress to play death, to flirt with her. And one of the most touching things I love, big spoiler alert for Fosse-Verdon, the miniseries, is it ends with Fosse's real death. And they make a meal out of the fact that when it comes time for Fosse to actually die, he dies on a sidewalk in Washington going to a previews of, I want to say it's a revival of Chicago,
Hmm.
but Gwen Verdon's he's in Gwen Verdon's arms and he's looking to her as he dies. And the way it's played, Fosse is afraid of death. He's just really scared. As opposed to this thing like in All That Jazz where it's flirtation. Like he's so flippant. And there's even lines in the movie where like one of the doctors says at one point he's foolishly, childishly flirting with disaster. Whenever like he's taking pills and having the parties in the hospital room and still smoking.
Right. You know, I wonder if I've thought about this before, that maybe that there's this that I mean, the easy answer is, of course, that we're all afraid of death. Everyone's like, it's easy to be flippant until the Reaper's actually knocking at your door, and then it's like, oh shit, I wasn't prepared for this. But I actually do kind of wonder with people who have, when it comes to artists who have made great works, who are leaving, who have been building a legacy, who have been building something. I always kind of wonder in the back of my head if there's this sort of romantic ideal of going out. Like there's always the fear as an artist that you're going to you're gonna fade out. You're gonna rust away. You're not gonna be able to sustain the creative output that you currently have.
Go towards indifference.
And so there is something romantic in theory about the idea of burning out all of a sudden rather than fading away. And that I think is, and so I just kind of wonder if there's that tension in the back of someone's mind like that who's dealing with that. I mean, I don't know. I'm not someone who's ever dealt with the depression or has ever dealt with in any serious way or has dealt with any sort of like suicidal thoughts or even engaged in any sort of like soft suicidal activities like drinking oneself to oblivion, or popping Dexedrine as much as he has. But I do wonder if there is that kind of in the back of one's head, is that and again from Fosse's perspective, making this movie, this feeling of I'm going to go out as making my art, and I'm going to embrace death, and it's going to be before my time, but I'll be remembered as like a martyr for my art or something like that.
I did find a quote in the Wasson book. I forget what project they were working on, but the great editor Craig McKay was working with Fosse on something, and Fosse gave him a quote saying, "Yeah, this is going to be my last thing." And I think it was before All That Jazz. It was either All That Jazz or before All That Jazz. It was something related to All That Jazz. I did want to point out weirdly. So this movie started, as best I can tell, going through the book. It was based on, they found a review of a book called Ending by Helm Wiltzen, and it was a book about death. And so Fosse then engaged in screenwriter Robert Allen Arthur, and he came up. They then started going back and forth because Fosse was big on this idea of using real life stuff for all of his work. There's the line in the movie where the Gideon character is told, "I just wish you didn't share your cock with so many people," and he's like, "That's a good line. I should use that."
Right.
And on the commentary, Heim says, "Yeah, Fosse took from life a lot." So there was a writing session where they just started exchanging real story ideas where they didn't change names. And then Arthur, in like 2 weeks, came up with this draft where he's just like, he uses Fosse's life with Fosse's names in there. And the reason I bring this up in terms of death is the production of this movie was a long time. They had to push it for a while. There's a few times they stopped production for Fosse to reconceive sequences and re-choreograph sequences. And during one stoppage, Arthur died of pancreatic cancer right in the middle of shooting.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot of death surrounding this movie.
Man. Yeah, I wonder if I'm really fascinated now about this notion of like to cast Jessica Lange as Angelique or whatever her name is, or the Angel of Death, is such a like, what is that? Is that because I wonder if she's more stunning in this movie than she's ever been anywhere. I mean, and Jessica Lange is a
she's pretty stunning.
all-time great.
I'm a big fan, like King Kong.
Yeah, no, she's great. But I just think that just the way she looks in this movie is just so idyllic. And you're right, there has to be something there. This notion that this horrifying thing is coming for me, but I'm going to turn it into this loving, gorgeous, woman who is both maternal and sensual at the same time, and I'm going to run to her embrace.
I go back to the Neil Gaiman version of death, where he conceived a character because it's like the person you want to see and like to embrace death. It's the person who's going to be kindest to you whenever death has to come, as opposed to this cold skeleton in a hood.
Fascinating.
All I really have left is the John Lithgow character was originally supposed to be played by Sidney Lumet.
That's interesting.
Yeah. We didn't go into the because there was that character is supposed to be based on like all the characters that Fosse felt were his rivals on Broadway on stage, like Mike Nichols and a few other stage directors I don't know of anymore. I guess we should go into the Richard Dreyfuss thing. He cast Richard Dreyfuss, and he was going to cut around Richard Dreyfuss dancing. It was Richard Dreyfuss literally had like Goodbye Girl and Close Encounters come out within 2 weeks of each other, and so he was big in there. But everyone involved, supposedly, including Heim, was trying to push like don't cast him. And Fosse's like, we'll make it work. We'll cut around him. And then they got on set, and Dreyfuss started directing some of the other dancers.
Oh wow.
And then Dreyfuss himself was just like, I can't do this, and backed out. And then he used his Jaws co-star friend. I think there was also a description of a dinner where Dreyfuss, or before, when he knew he was going to leave but hadn't done it yet, had dinner and told Schneider, like, I think, what do you think of this? Like, he even kind of approached him about that. Back to the Jesus Christ Superstar thing, I wanted to point out, Musical in the Desert. I did watch a few of Fosse's big cinematic achievements before, not stuff he didn't necessarily direct, maybe he choreographed. I got, there's a sequence in My Sister Eileen, which was supposedly one of his best, because he actually did appear on film. When he started out, he thought he was going to be the next Gene Kelly. And he has a sequence in My Sister Eileen that I watched on YouTube that was pretty cool. He's in Damn Yankees, which that sequence is shown a lot in Fosse-Verdon, and that actually is a really, really cool sequence. But the one sequence that everyone on YouTube loses their shit over, and admittedly is really amazing, is a Stanley Donen children's film from the mid-70s called Little Prince, where, are you familiar?
No.
It's the basis of Michael Jackson's Moonwalk and the Billie G thing, but he basically does a sequence where he plays a snake in a desert trying to seduce this little kid, and he talks in these strong S snake sounds, but it's the basis Michael Jackson got the Moonwalk from, basically. And look it up on YouTube. It is really something. When Michael Jackson debuted the Moonwalk, I think it was at the BET Awards in like 83 or 84. He was wearing a very similar uniform to what Fosse wore in this sequence.
I had no. Wait. So Jackson got the Moonwalk from Fosse? Like,
it's an extension of it. If you ever thought of Michael Jackson's dancing style and you think of a snake moving, you can see it. And like Jackson was pretty open about saying Fosse was an influence, and apparently got to the point where he was trying to get Fosse to direct the Smooth Criminal video. This is that period where Jackson got like John Landis to do the Thriller video, Scorsese to do the Bad video. Coppola did the Captain EO. He was getting big directors to do big stuff. And so he wanted Fosse to do, back when Smooth Criminal, I forget what the original name was, but when Smooth Criminal was still a demo, he sent it to Fosse and wanted him to do the music video for it.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Slight tangent. Two slight tangents. So I just showed my daughter the Smooth Criminal video for the first time, because every now and then we'll just sit down again, trying to get her into the things that I like and I'm passionate about. So I've been showing. So whenever we have spare time, I'll sit down with my phone.
Per Fosse showing his daughter passion through dancing.
Exactly. I'll show her various clips from different musicals or different dancing. She loves Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly is one of my favorites, and so she anything with Gene Kelly she'll watch. But I showed her the Smooth Criminal video, and the point in time, whenever Michael Jackson like leans forward and almost, I'm not sure what the move is called, but where like
I know what you're talking about.
Leans forward, far and comes back. She was like, oh, it blew her mind. But the other thing I'll say is the subway stop where they filmed the Bad music video. It was very, very close to where I used to live.
Really?
Yeah. If I remember correctly, it's the Hoyt Schermerhorn subway stop in Brooklyn. And the reason why they filmed there, they've actually filmed a lot of stuff there because there's what's called a dummy platform. There's a platform where no trains come by. It's like got multiple platforms. And so there's always like this dark platform over there that I used to always look at and be like, that's where every time I'd go with anybody, that's where they filmed the bad music video over there.
I want to say that scene came up in a recent episode when we were talking about Rumblefish, because the opening fight in Rumblefish, even though it's in Oklahoma, very similar, resembles the opening fight in the Bad video.
Yep. Very good subway stop. But we do have to talk just for a second. I got to cycle back about Roy Scheider. Every time he comes up in this movie, and I see him at first, like the couple times I've seen this movie, at first I was like, why did they cast him? Like, he always looks so. The first couple of scenes, I'm always like, he's the wrong person to be in this movie. Then, Roy Scheider's such an incredible actor. He eventually gets into it, and he's great. But I always think of him as being such a strange casting choice.
He's pretty blank at the beginning, I guess. Yeah.
Well, just also the way he looks. He looks like a '70s porn director or something. But it's just like
Okay,
he
okay.
and again he delivers an incredible performance, and by the end I don't question it at all. But I never would have thought of him as like, if you're casting this movie, to cast him as this character. Again, I don't know much about Fosse in real life and what he looked like and his mannerisms and stuff like that. Um, so maybe Scheider's great for it, but
I
anyway,
mean,
it's
I I have a big soft spot for Roy Scheider. Like Roy Scheider, he came. They had to push whenever they switched to him. He was shooting Jonathan Demme's very underrated movie Last Embrace, which um, just Roy Scheider in the '70s was just awesome.
oh
Like
yeah, he was in everything that was great. He was like in it.
yeah, and so um, I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks that Fosse may have been leaning toward things that obfuscate, because clearly the dress was going to look like him. Fosse, I mean, he has the bowler hat is the big part of his dress, and he will openly admit that that was because of his receding hairline, and his receding hairline was the reason he never became Gene Kelly on film and had to switch to directing and choreography. It was a big reason, I assume, but um, I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, so he does Star 80 after this, and then he mainly is on stage as film people. I don't know about you, but I barely know what he did after that. There was a few mentions in the book. I didn't read some of that stuff. His last thing he almost did was he tried to do a movie on Walter Winchell that Michael Herr was going to write. Michael Herr was the man who wrote the great Vietnam book Dispatches, but which then got Kubrick to have him co-write Full Metal Jacket amongst three other writers.
Right.
And Michael Herr wrote also great, one of the best books on Kubrick too, and
Hmm.
that was what he was working on when he died.
How old was he when he died? You know?
Mid 50s, I think. It was a heart attack, and I mean, like, unsurprisingly and anticlimactically, a heart attack he died of.
Yeah, that's so wild.
He died so young. It's just you, I was thinking in terms of, if you look at, I don't think he's mentioned barely any in the Peter Biskin book Easy Rider Raging Bulls, but it seems like the fact that it's a big director who didn't have that like time where he just faded out in the '80s, he just died. It has that Hal Ashby feel where like he just died too young, and like great stuff. Like, and it's why like I'm pissed off of like, why were you flirting with death? You had so much more. You could have these other directors had so much more that they did.
Yeah. Well, the thing that the reason why I always like to bring up Fosse and talk about Fosse is because I'm his legacy is so strange to me as someone who truly admires his films and some of the stuff that you know the technical achievements that he was able to achieve with his filmmaking. I'm so surprised that like you know he's in some ways he's become a little bit of a punchline. Like everyone knows of him as like the Fosse hands, jazz hands,
You know, after
and
we just did this Mike Nichols episode a few episodes back, and after we got done recording it, I pointed out that like I was going to do a Fosse episode, and that he was a contemporary rival of Mike Nichols, and it was my with host Ted Haycraft, and he kind of made a crack of like the joke, which is an improvised joke in Birdcage, but where Robin Williams in a Mike Nichols film goes Fosse, Fosse, Fosse.
yeah, he's. I mean, and it's sad because he's like, I mean, clearly he's, and I think people know this. They know him as being a better choreographer than just jazz hands. Like but I do think that in that aspect of it, like if you think of Fosse, you think of the choreographer. Very few people think of the Fosse the filmmaker. And not
Which is
only
so
Fosse the
weird.
filmmaker, but yeah, but the like adventurous, artistically advancing filmmaker that he was. And even like, because Hal Ashby, I do agree, is somebody who's kind of faded away a little bit in terms of like the name, but there's such a cult following for
Around his period, and the
yeah,
like
yeah.
going from Harold and Maude all the way to maybe Coming Home, like that period is pretty heralded, and like it's, I mean, Fosse made 3 movies. Like, one of the things the Wasson book pointed out was the basic reason Fosse took to editing, which I think is the main reason I wanted to talk to you about this, just because like he's one of the most editorially brave and giving towards his editors to experiment and do most with films. it came from like his obsession with the choreography and like the fact that his style involved the like weird little rhythmic hand jabs that come off like a hand on the hip where the fingers would then flip out. He wanted to cut to the close up rhythmically of that and things like that.
Oh,
And
that's so interesting.
expanding from there.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the musicality and what's that involved in editing, but whenever people talk to, you know, in the editing that I do, I know this is true for you, Shane. You know, so I'm always heavily. I do a lot of work with the soundtrack, both the musical soundtrack as well as the sound effects tracks. Whenever I'm editing, and I consider myself to be very very musically inclined, and so I'm always when I'm interviewing for jobs or I'm discussing jobs with directors before I actually take the job, I'm always talking about, okay, what do we think about in terms of music, or even absence of music, doesn't matter, but it's all the same thing. But like, what do we, or like, you know, the first question I always ask is like, what music are you listening to while you're either writing the film or planning for the film or whatnot? Because I do think that music.
The first question I ask directors are, what scores do you want to temp this with?
Yeah, and so, and I always tell people, you know, I'm amateur, maybe too advanced of a word, but I'm an amateur musician myself. And
I know you, Keith. Not an amateur. Not an amateur.
and I always, I tell, and I always, people always get excited about that because they understand that the musicality of editing is everything. It's all rhythm. It's all, I mean, it's not just rhythm. There is also, you know, the choosing and understanding of performance and story structure and whatnot. But the musicality.
It does seem like a lot of it is rhythm and body language. Is the things, the sauce no one pays it to, that is the secret to all of it.
Right. And you know, I don't think about it enough. I mean, so I I don't know if I want this to get out there, but I'll say it. So I did flirt with dance for a long time. You know, I
have pictures too, by the way.
So not only, yeah, we mentioned my musical theater background. I came from a background of theater, but I did do a lot of classes in dance and whatnot. And I'm a terrible dancer, so take that for what it's worth. But I admire the craft of dancing so much, and I love watching dance sequences from old movies. Like I know my daughter and I were watching clips from West Side Story the other day, and just I admire them so much.
They talk of West Side Story as this big. It's Oklahoma, West Side Story, and Cabaret, I think, are the big musicals that are big trend centers they talk about in the Wasson book.
Yeah, and I just think that there's something. I mean, you know, whenever I'm doing like my morning jogs, and you know, you have to like your brain has to kind of melt away and get into the rhythm of the jog, and your brain goes into various places. The main place where mine goes to is the stage, and like imagining myself dancing and picturing myself as a beautiful butterfly dancer. Someone who can dance well, and that's kind of like my happy space. And I've never been that kind of person. I enjoy dancing. I will cut a rug at any wedding, but the notion of being a trained classical dancer who's so in touch with one's body has always been so fascinating to me. And I don't know if it heartens me to think about Fosse taking that sort of love and passion and transitioning it into an editing style that is so unique and fascinating.
I get that. I think the transition to the editorial style, just because that's the stuff that history is going to remember. I think the thing I found fascinatingly odd and weird, the musical I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I wrote, one of the most notable things about it is there's no dancing in it. In fact, there's a line in the movie I wrote that I was so proud of, where a character asks another character to dance, and the other character responds with, "Oh, I don't dance. I don't like people with confidence." And one of the things that, like with the Wasson book and the Fosse-Verdon series, when they show, weirdly, everyone gives Fosse credit as someone for such a perfectionist. Like, we also haven't talked about like his general creative style of constantly changing, constantly reworking. Nothing is set in stone. Everything is fluid. Everything has a tiny bit of way of improvement. And he's dealing with these dancers, and he's actually really kind to them as he's constantly improving their performance. Although occasionally they show points where he seems like he might or might not be cruel to them. I didn't mention one of the fascinating things that both the miniseries and the book takes on is the book opens with the quote with Bob Fosse asking, "How much time do I have left?" with the idea being that he has an infinite amount of ideas that he can maybe try an A and B on and maybe improve or not. And so within the style of both the miniseries and the book is structurally done with how many time he has left in his life. So each chapter in the book is like 12 years left or 11 years left. And the miniseries is done with how much time is left till he dies. And then obviously it builds up to his death scene in the miniseries.
Well, that reminds me of two things. The first thing is a quote from Isaac Asimov, which I used to have on my computer screen for a while, which was, if I think he said something, I'm gonna destroy it, but it was basically, if someone told me I only had 6 minutes left to live, I would simply write faster. And which, if you know Isaac Asimov's, Isaac Asimov, I think he published like 150 books or something like that in his lifetime.
He had this great writing thing. I remembered, I think it was him that said that one of the best methods to help him writing was to go watch a bad movie in a theater.
Oh, that's interesting.
He would get bored with the movie and then start thinking about his own story.
That's interesting. I used to do, I'm not much of a writer, but like I used to do that in church. That was always I used to go to church still a lot when I was still in film school and I was making short films. And that's where I would get all my ideas from, because there's something, I grew up Catholic. And so there's something about the Catholic service that is, I don't know if you know this about the Catholic services, but they do, it's like, there's a structured, you do the first reading, the second reading, and then the homily. And, the first reading, the second reading, the gospel, and then the homily. And
you bad
the reading
Catholic.
Yeah, I know. It's been years, and I think they've probably changed it up since I last went anyway. The readings in the gospel are always the same every year. That particular day on that year, it's always the same. So you've heard these stories countless times if you've gone to church ever since you were a kid. And the particular church that I went to, the homily that was read by the priest or the deacon, we didn't have very enigmatic or very charismatic. We didn't have very charismatic speakers, so they were always very boring. Anyway, this is just to say my mind would always drift into this kind of trance-like state, and I found like those were the best ideas I got. It was the only time, because it's the only time in your life where you slip into that kind of state of boardom, and you're
Is that why all your short films were about guilt?
They're about guilt. They're both about guilt and religion. A lot of them were too, because I was like, that's where I was doing all the writing I was doing.
Alan Heim, have you? He still lives in New York. Have you ever crossed his path?
Not that I know of. I didn't know he's not an editor that I followed. His career-wise, like as much as some of the other people I.
Me neither. Like, it's weird because like I watched for the first time Liza with a Z, which was where he got Fosse got the E for the EGOT, and it was where the first exchange where he worked with Heim, and Heim was his editor until the end. And
yeah, let me see.
He worked with LeMay. Cindy LeMay recommended him. And Fosse was a big Fosse. It's weird because Fosse had more of a Kubrickian output, but like he wanted to make a movie a year with craft like LeMay, and like the hardness of Cabaret, especially when you compare it to Sweet Charity. Going to that, you could see LeMay coming out of that too, not just the Fellini. It's LeMay. Yeah.
That's interesting. Because I wrote down some of Alan Heim's, like I was like trying to go back through his filmography, and I saw obviously he did Network, which is amazing, Hair, which is one of the most musicals that I love, the John Hughes film, She's Having a Baby, and American History X. Which I know
American History X. That was another one that was a big movie to me too as a teen in high school.
Beautifully put together, and then I obviously know there's so much like insane stories behind like how the editing of that, and like how like the and Tony Kaye and all the difficulty with that.
That bathroom sequence still that's a pretty defining thing for me in high school.
Oh, amazing! I haven't seen that movie in years, but I do hold it back in my mind as like being a beautifully made film. I did want to ask though. I noticed Alan Heim's his work changes at a certain point in terms of the kind of films that he's getting, and I noticed that he worked on The Adventures of Pluto Nash, and
which former guest Paul Hirsch worked on too.
And I remember because I read Paul Hirsch's book. And I saw that Paul Hirsch had some trouble, like what he was able to like that movie being the massive bomb that it was.
He famously said that like he at one point worked on the biggest and the biggest box office hit and biggest box office bomb of all time in Star Wars.
And so I wonder if Alan Heim had any difficulty after that as well. I mean, which is weird because, like, you know, people like Alan Heim or Paul Hirsch who have these like storied careers and have built up this like insane. I mean, like the careers they've had before they had this bomb are so incredible. You would think that, oh, who cares? But like,
well, you know, one quote he said at the end of the commentary I found fascinating was he was talking about, or no director had challenged him. He's the big recent credits he lauded it were his work with Nick Cassavetes, John Cassavetes' son.
yeah.
But he said no editor or director had challenged him like Nick Cassavetes had since Bob Fosse. But
Oh, interesting.
you know, I didn't bring this up. You know, the big reason why I think the ending didn't work for you is that the original conception of the ending was supposed to be that the John Lithgow character was going to take over the show after Joe died, and the show was going to be a success. And there was one iteration of the script or the conception of the movie where the ghost of Joe was going to see the success of the show after he died.
I think that would have.
I don't know how that works subjectively, because like the movie's so inherently subjective. But
No, I think that would have been interesting. Now that you mention it, because like it's like that. What I was missing was the feeling of retribution. Maybe, I don't know. I like something like, here's a person who's committed all these sins in his life against these women, right? And they still love him. They still love him for it, even though like, even his ex-wife loves him, even though she kind of hates him. Yeah. And he's still successful. And really, the only retribution he gets is he dies, which he almost wasn't even that worried about. He was flirting with death, as we talked about.
And in the end is treated as a bad thing because he's being taken away from his daughter too. Yeah.
Right, but it's like he should have. It's almost like, yeah, the movie, he should have had a failure. Like that would have been interesting, because had the play that
there was no failure in the movie. Oh my gosh, wow.
Had the play that he had been struggling with been taken over by somebody else and become a success, that would have been interesting, because that would have shown that like it wasn't like he wasn't this unique. I mean, I think it's so important to have a little bit of humility in there, like to show that like it wasn't just that like someone else was able to take something that he was struggling with and make success with. That almost would have been more painful to him, or a bigger failure to him, than just the act of dying or something.
Based on the character, yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm gonna keep going back to the 8.5 thing. The thing about 8.5 that makes it so great is that he doesn't make the movie. Like the movie's like he fails at making the movie, which is so interesting. And it, like that kind of dissolves, and the movie it becomes something about an exploration of different aspects of his life. You know, so he's a failure in the movie, and that's what makes it so interesting that a director would show that about himself.
You know, at the end of the day, Keith, I gotta be honest. The big thing after reading all this Fosse stuff, watching Fosse-Verdon, yeah, I mean, I love his work. He expanded the form. He was a man who pushed people, especially editorially. End of the day, I think I want to rewatch 8.5 right now.
I mean, as much as I love all that jazz, 8.5 is an untouched movie. Oh my God.
Keith Fraase, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to me. You're definitely going to come back for multiple episodes, hopefully. But thank you so much for being here.
It has been my pleasure. I'll take you up on that invitation anytime. I love watching movies and talking about them with you, man. It's been great.
Thanks, man.
Sure.